The cabin was quiet. Tension hovered above the recycled air, cloaked in hum of engines at 30,000 feet. In seat 12B sat a teenager, auburn hair tied back, eyes steady like her father taught her. Emma Blake didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. Not because of who she was, but how she carried herself. Calm, direct, quietly composed. It wasn't until a spilled soda and a harsh tone broke the routine flight that things turned ugly. The flight attendant, older, sharp-edged, exhausted, by a long day, snapped. Words were exchanged. Then without warning, she raised a hand and slapped Emma across the cheek. Silence followed. Passengers froze. Emma didn't cry. She didn't argue. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and made one call. Not to the police, not to the airline, but to a man who never lost his temper, only his patience. Jason Blake was no stranger to crisis. But when his daughter whispered what had just happened, his voice dropped an octave. "Keep calm. I'm handling this." That plane didn't complete its journey. It never reached its destination. Because within 20 minutes, everything changed. If you've ever questioned how far a father would go to protect his child, not with fists, but with justice, you're about to find out. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you think one phone call can change the course of a flight. Because in this story, it did. Jason Blake wasn't a man of indulgence. He lived with precision. A widower for nearly a decade, he raised his daughter Emma with the kind of discipline born from a life that demanded order. Former military intelligence, now quietly contracted by security firms that valued discretion over dramatics. Jason was never loud, never boastful. He believed in action over words. Emma, now 17, had inherited her father's steady gaze and unshakable posture. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't rebellious. She understood things most teenagers didn't. Consequences, accountability, silence as strength. Her trip to Denver was a school-organized visit to a national academic conference. Jason had reviewed the flight manifest, the security protocols, even the weather patterns before letting her board. He'd taught her everything he knew about reading a room, staying calm, and choosing her moment. So when her name flashed across, his caller ID mid-morning, and he heard her controlled voice describe the slap, Jason's heart didn't race. It narrowed. He didn't shout. He didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. He made 3 calls. First to the FAA contact who owed him a favor. Second to the airline's executive risk liaison. And finally, to someone even higher, a former senator whose family Jason had once protected during an overseas ambush. By the time the cabin crew heard the ping of redirected course instructions, Emma sat quietly in her seat, ice pressed to her cheek while every steward and passenger grew increasingly unsettled. The plane wasn't in trouble. It wasn't hijacked, but something had happened, something serious, and Jason Blake was now the invisible force changing the air around them. This wasn't about revenge, it was about principle. And for Jason, that was more than enough. 35 minutes earlier, Flight 229 from Los Angeles to Denver had departed without incident. Emma had boarded early, stowed her carry-on, and settled into her window seat with a book. The flight attendant in question, Margaret Nolan, 53, 16 years on the job, was already on edge before takeoff. 2 delays earlier in the day, an understaffed crew and personal grievances she kept close to the vest had frayed her patience. Margaret didn't recognize Emma, nor did she care. What she saw was another teenage girl with headphones and attitude. When Emma politely declined the drink service, Margaret muttered under her breath and moved on. Minutes later, the turbulence caused a nearby tray to slip, and a soda spilled on Margaret's uniform. She turned furious, assuming Emma had knocked it. Emma apologized, gently, sincerely, but that didn't stop Margaret's simmer from boiling over. What followed was unthinkable for any airline professional, an open-handed slap to Emma's face. It wasn't hard, but it was loud and wrong. Passengers stared in stunned disbelief. One man unbuckled, intent on intervening, but Emma raised a hand, not to stop him, but to steady herself. She reached for her phone and made the call. The Woman across the aisle would later say it was the calmest reaction she'd ever seen. Margaret realized too late what she'd done. Not because she feared consequence, but because she saw the look in Emma's eyes. Not fear, not pain, control. Meanwhile, 36,000 feet below, Jason was already moving. He wasn't a celebrity, but he was someone who, when he called, people answered. And by the time Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee in the galley, thinking she'd dodged reprimand, the flight was being rerouted, not for emergency, but accountability. The plane banked slightly, its course shifting westward. The pilot made a calm announcement, citing air traffic patterns and a necessary detour to a nearby airport. Most passengers took it in stride, a few raised eyebrows. Emma sat silently, eyes forward, cheeks still tinged red. Margaret felt the change immediately. The crew whispered. The lead attendant was pulled aside, confusion sweeping across her face. She approached Margaret, hushed but firm. "They want to speak with you. Right now. Corporate's on the line." The phone call was short. Sharp, not about protocol, not about explanation, but about a very specific passenger and an incident already under review. Margaret's face paled. She insisted it was a misunderstanding. The supervisor replied only, "The father's involved, you know who he is?" Margaret didn't, not then. But when the name Jason Blake came up, the room shifted. His record was sealed, but whispers about him weren't. A man who operated below radar, respected even in circles where power came without titles. A fixer, some said. Others used words like silent hammer. Margaret tried to apologize. She approached Emma mid-aisle, words rehearsed. But Emma didn't flinch. She looked at the woman with the same stillness her father used before delivering. "Truth no one wanted to hear. You don't get to apologize to me," Emma said softly. "You'll speak to my father." Margaret backed away. Meanwhile, Jason wasn't calling news stations or threatening lawsuits. He was setting a precedent, one that made airlines re-examine every staff protocol before takeoff. He was leveraging respect, not rage. And as the plane began descent toward a private security checkpoint, more than one passenger began recording, not because of spectacle, but because they sensed it too. Something important was happening. Jason Blake hadn't always been calm. In his younger years, he'd been quick to react, quicker to judge. But age, pain, and fatherhood had reshaped him. He learned patience the hard way, through funerals, deployments, and a wife lost too soon. Raising Emma had taught him the final lesson. Strength wasn't in force, but in presence. As he waited near the tarmac at a restricted facility in Colorado Springs, he wasn't pacing. He wasn't armed. He stood with his hands behind his back, the badge around his neck identifying him only as Advisor DHS Clearance 7. Emma's call had pierced him, not because of the slap, but because she'd waited. She'd followed. His teachings, even in pain. That's what hurt most. Back on the plane, Margaret sat alone. Her co-workers no longer defended her. The murmurs from passengers had shifted. One woman was crying. A young couple near the back kept replaying the audio they'd recorded. Margaret had hoped for a moment of silence. Instead, she was drowning in it. Emma, meanwhile, was steady. Her father had taught her that character is revealed in the moments no one prepares you for. And even now, as the wheels touched down and the sun dipped behind the Rockies, she wasn't thinking about revenge. She was thinking about what her mother would have said. What you let go defines you. But this couldn't be let go. Jason watched the plane taxi. He could have had it grounded in a dozen ways, but he'd chosen this route for one reason only, to remind the world what accountability looked like when pursued with grace, not aggression. Justice, after all, doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be seen. The moment Emma stepped off the plane, she saw him, her father standing just outside the restricted terminal doors. He hadn't aged much in the last 5 years, but grief had carved subtle lines into his face. His expression didn't shift when he saw her. He simply nodded, like she'd completed a mission exactly as he'd trained her to. Emma walked straight into his arms. Not for comfort, but for affirmation. He held her for a moment, just long enough for her to hear him breathe out the tension he'd been holding. "You did good, Em," he said quietly. Authorities approached. Not law enforcement, not yet. Airline executives, FAA representatives, and a single investigator from the Department of Transportation. They wanted statements, timelines, a review of cabin footage. Emma answered calmly. Jason stood nearby, saying nothing unless prompted. Inside the plane, Margaret was escorted to the front, her badge temporarily revoked pending investigation. She looked over at Emma as she descended the stairs, expecting to see triumph. Instead, she saw something worse. Indifference. The story wasn't viral yet. The public didn't know, but the machinery had started to move. For now, Emma and Jason were escorted to a private lounge. The airline offered apologies. Jason refused compensation. This isn't about money, he told them. It's about restoring what she was taught. To believe in, that adults protect, not punish. Margaret, meanwhile, was being questioned in a side office. Her story shifted with each retelling. Her composure, once so fierce, had begun to crack. And yet, there was a brief calm. Emma drank water. Jason checked his messages. The silence felt earned, but Jason knew this wasn't the end. Airlines don't change overnight, and sometimes, to make them listen, you have to keep speaking, even when your voice is a whisper. Just when Jason believed the worst had passed, a call came in, not from the airline, but from a federal liaison with a strained tone. "We're receiving pressure," she said. "Internal pushback. They want this to go away quietly, minimal exposure." Jason knew the game, damage control. The higher-ups didn't want a scandal. A suspended employee was manageable. A full-blown public incident, not so much. "They're painting this as an overreaction," she added, "saying your daughter exaggerated, that the slap was accidental." Jason didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He asked for access to the internal footage. It had been pulled, locked behind corporate legal departments. Convenient, predictable. "Then I'll release the recordings from the passengers," Jason said, matter of fact. "I've already got 4 videos sent to me. One includes the audio of the slap. The rest include her reaction. Silent, collected, not a word out of place." The woman on the phone went quiet. "Let me remind you," Jason continued, "I'm not after headlines, but I won't let them rewrite what happened. Not to her." Meanwhile, news had started to stir online. A few tweets, vague references. Nothing viral, yet. But people were asking questions. Back at the airport, Emma stood watching through a frosted window as executives huddled behind closed doors. She understood now. This wasn't just about her. It was about systems, about silence being more convenient than correction. Jason joined her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "They think if they stall long enough," he said, "we'll back down." Emma looked up. "Will we?" He didn't smile. He didn't blink. Not a chance. By late afternoon, the tide had turned. The airline's risk management division sent an official to meet Jason and Emma in person. A man in a navy suit with soft hands and a plastic smile. His words were polished, but they slipped off Jason like rain on stone. "We deeply regret this misunderstanding," the man began. "Miss Blake, we commend your composure. We're prepared to offer a private settlement to ensure your continued trust in our airline." Jason didn't move. Emma responded first. "You're offering me money so no one else finds out?" The man blinked, unsure if he should address the teenager or her father. Jason leaned in slightly. "This isn't a misunderstanding. It's misconduct. And my daughter doesn't need your money. She needs your accountability." The executive paused. "We can't fire someone without full review." Jason stepped forward, not threatening but resolute. "I'm not asking you to fire her," he said. "I'm asking you to own what happened, publicly, because if you don't, the videos go live, and I won't post them anonymously. I'll do it with my name." The man faltered. "You'd go public with this?" Jason nodded. "Because I have nothing to hide." "Can you say the same?" Silence settled again. This time not from uncertainty, but from fear. Not of Jason's fists, but of his unwavering clarity. Of a man unwilling to be appeased or bought off. The executive left, promising a call within the hour. Jason watched him go, then turned to Emma. "You sure you're okay?" She nodded. I'm sure. But the truth was, she wasn't okay. She was changed. And Jason knew sometimes justice leaves scars even when it wins. The call came 47 minutes later. Jason answered without ceremony. On the other end, the airline's chief operating officer spoke directly. Her voice was tight, professional, but with a distinct edge of concession. We've reviewed the footage. There's no ambiguity. It happened exactly as your daughter described. Jason said nothing. We've placed the attendant on indefinite suspension. A full internal investigation has been initiated. We'll be releasing a statement acknowledging the incident and outlining steps we're taking to prevent future occurrences. Still, Jason waited. We'd also like to extend an apology to Emma. Not through PR, but directly. A letter signed and sealed. Jason glanced at Emma, who was watching quietly from the far seat. She nodded once. I'll give you a name, Jason said. The woman across the aisle who recorded it. Include her in the process. She stepped up when others stayed silent. There was a pause on the line. Understood. The call ended without further flourish. Jason slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and exhaled, a breath long held. Emma stood. So, that's it? He looked at her, eyes steady. That's the beginning. Across the country, the airline's statement dropped. Not buried at the bottom of a press release, but highlighted, with language that acknowledged the harm, and outlined a path forward. Media picked it up. The story never exploded, but it ignited something deeper. Quiet passengers came forward. Former employees spoke up. The story stayed alive not because of anger, but because of the integrity with which it was handled. Back home, Emma returned to school. People stared, whispered, but no one mocked, because they'd all seen the clip. They'd seen her calm, and they'd seen what happens when strength isn't loud, just right. Some stories make noise, others make change. This one did both, in quiet, deliberate ways that echoed further than outrage ever could. Jason Blake never sought headlines. He didn't post the footage himself. He didn't grant interviews or seek praise. He simply made sure the truth was acknowledged, and that his daughter knew she never had to raise her voice to be heard. Emma, too, changed. Not in the way trauma changes someone, but in how clarity forges identity. She knew who she was before, the flight. But now the world did too. She carried herself differently, not in pride, but in purpose. And while the scar on her cheek faded in days, the lesson carved deeper. For the airline, it marked a quiet reckoning. Training manuals were revised, cabin crew reevaluated, not because of fear, but because someone dared to demand better without rage or riot. And for others watching, fathers, daughters, strangers in waiting terminals, the story planted something simple, yet powerful. The belief that when wrong is met with calm strength, resolution becomes not just possible but undeniable. Jason never looked back on that day with anger. He looked back on it as a test of restraint, of legacy, of what it means to protect not just with power, but with principle. So when people ask if one phone call can change a flight's course, the answer is yes, because it's not about the call itself, it's about who makes it and why. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you believe justice really looks like, because sometimes it wears a suit and sometimes it walks off a plane without saying a word.